Trump pushed Canada. China took the wheat market. The move did not begin with a single announcement or a dramatic rupture. It unfolded through tone, posture, and pressure. As Donald Trump escalated trade rhetoric toward Canada, publicly questioning fairness, privately signaling leverage, the relationship between the two longtime partners began to harden. Tariffs were floated, exemptions threatened, and uncertainty became a policy tool. For Washington, the pressure was meant to discipline. For Ottawa, it became a warning. Canada did not respond with counter threats or public defiance. There were no fiery speeches or retaliatory tariff lists splashed across headlines. Instead, officials began to do what mid-sized powers have learned to do in an era of great power volatility. They quietly looked for options, not replacements, at least not at first, but alternatives, ways to reduce exposure, ways to ensure that a single political shift south of the border could not upend entire sectors overnight. Agriculture was among the first areas reviewed. Wheat, in particular, sat at the intersection of economics and politics. For decades, Canadian wheat had flowed naturally into U.S. markets and through U.S.-linked trading systems. The assumption of continuity was so deeply embedded that few questioned it. But assumptions are fragile when pressure replaces predictability. As uncertainty mounted, Canadian exporters began exploratory conversations elsewhere. China, already the world's largest agricultural importer and keen to diversify suppliers, was receptive. There were no press releases, no summits, no joint statements. Just technical meetings, trial shipments, and contract language adjusted quietly in boardrooms and ministries. What emerged were long-term purchasing agreements that made sense on paper and required no political theater to justify. Wheat contracts began to shift, not in dramatic volumes at first, small reallocations, incremental diversions, flexibility clauses rewritten. The kind of changes that do not move markets overnight or trigger alerts. Traders noticed the flows but dismissed them as temporary. Analysts focused on louder trade fights elsewhere. There was no single moment to point to, no clear line marking when the balance dipped. By the time US farmers and commodity traders began to feel the change, it was already embedded. Prices softened. Demand assumptions no longer held. Questions surfaced on trading floors about why certain Canadian volumes were no longer available, why Chinese buyers were absent from expected channels. The realization came slowly and uncomfortably. The market had adjusted without asking permission. This was not a confrontation. No sanctions were announced. No retaliatory tariffs imposed. It was something more subtle and more consequential. A supply relationship had been rerouted not out of hostility but out of risk management. Pressure had produced caution, and caution had produced diversification. In the end, the misplay was not aggression itself, but the failure to consider second-order effects. By tightening pressure without foresight, Washington had signaled unpredictability. Canada responded not with resistance, but with quiet adaptation. China simply stepped into the space that opened, and a market changed hands without a fight, leaving those who assumed permanence to discover too late that stability is not guaranteed by history alone. Diplomatic tension rarely announces its economic consequences in real time. It accumulates quietly, expressed not through treaties torn up on camera, but through hesitation-paused calls, delayed approvals, language softened or sharpened behind closed doors. As political relations between Washington and Ottawa grew more strained, uncertainty seeped into places where stability had long been assumed. For markets built on predictability, that uncertainty mattered more than any single policy headline. Canadian exporters felt it first. Agriculture operates on thin margins and long timelines. Planting decisions are made months before harvest, contracts negotiated long before delivery. When political tension introduces even the possibility of disruption, exporters do not wait for clarity. They look for stability, not ideology, not alignment. Just assurance that goods will move, payments will clear, and contracts will be honored regardless of the next news cycle. China understood this dynamic well. As a buyer, it did not need to make speeches or issue demands. It simply offered what markets crave most in volatile times: guaranteed demand. long-term purchase commitments, clear pricing frameworks, and logistical coordination that reduced risk for sellers. There was no grand geopolitical framing attached. The message was practical and unambiguous: supply us reliably, and we will buy reliably. The response was methodical. Canadian wheat exporters began shifting focus, not abandoning existing relationships but rebalancing exposure. Conversations turned into memoranda. Memoranda became contracts. Over time, long-term wheat supply agreements were signed that locked in volumes and timelines stretching years into the future. These were not speculative trades. They were structural decisions designed to anchor revenue and reduce vulnerability. None of this required a diplomatic breakthrough or public reconciliation. In fact, it unfolded largely below the political radar. While officials debated tariffs and trade language, the market moved on its own logic. Shipping routes adjusted, financing followed contracts. Infrastructure planning quietly aligned with new flows. Step by step, the supply chain reoriented itself. For the United States, the shift was subtle enough to be missed at first. There was no single policy loss to point to, no dramatic exclusion from negotiations. Influence simply faded from certain links in the chain. Where US-centric systems once mediated trade, alternatives emerged. Where American demand once anchored pricing assumptions, it became just one variable among many. By the time the change was visible, it was already normalized. Traders adapted models. Farmers adjusted expectations. Buyers recalibrated sourcing strategies. What had begun as a hedge against uncertainty hardened into routine practice. The market had found a new equilibrium, and reversing it would now require effort, incentives, and time. This is how silent handoffs occur. Not through declarations, but through accumulated decisions made in pursuit of stability. Politics set the conditions, but markets executed the transition. Faster than debates, quieter than summits, and far more difficult to unwind. The new normal locked in without asking for approval from anyone who assumed the old one would last. The pressure on Canada did not arrive all at once. It accumulated through rhetoric, policy signals, and the steady reminder that access to the US market could no longer be treated as unconditional. Trade disputes, shifting priorities in Washington, and the reemergence of leverage as a political tool forced Ottawa to confront an uncomfortable reality: dependence, even on a longtime partner, carries risk when predictability erodes. For years, Canada's economic strategy had rested on proximity and integration. The US market was not just a destination, it was the default. But as pressure grew, Canadian policymakers began reassessing what had once seemed unthinkable. The question was not whether to sever ties, but whether relying so heavily on a single market left the country exposed to decisions it could not control. Wheat emerged as the first real test case. It was large enough to matter, stable enough to restructure, and politically quiet enough to adjust without provoking backlash. Canadian wheat exports had long flowed through established channels linked to US demand and pricing assumptions. Altering that flow would signal something deeper than a simple trade tweak. It would demonstrate intent. The transition was handled deliberately. Rather than dramatic redirection, Canada allowed volume to shift gradually. China, already seeking reliable agricultural suppliers, absorbed the wheat smoothly. Its purchasing capacity, logistics infrastructure, and willingness to commit to long-term agreements made the adjustment almost frictionless. What could have been disruptive instead felt routine. For Canadian farmers, the impact was stabilizing rather than shocking. Guaranteed demand reduced price volatility. Long-term contracts brought predictability to planning cycles that had been increasingly strained by geopolitical uncertainty. Income stabilized not because prices surged, but because risk declined. In agriculture, that distinction matters. As the new arrangements settled into place, a subtle but significant change occurred. Washington's leverage weakened. The ability to influence outcomes through access threats diminished as alternatives proved viable. Pressure that once carried weight now met a quieter response: diversification instead of concession. Canada's exit strategy was never announced because it was never framed as an exit. It was presented internally as resilience, onsurance, on prudence. Loyalty, after all, is sustainable only when it is not forced. by choosing self-preservation over assumption. Canada demonstrated a lesson many mid-sized economies are relearning. In a world of shifting power, security lies not in proximity but in options. Trump's approach to trade rested on a simple assumption: proximity equals dependence. Canada, in this view, had no real alternative to the US market and would ultimately bend under pressure. Geography, history, and integration were treated as leverage tools to extract concessions rather than relationships to be managed. What this overlooked was how modern markets respond when power is applied without subtlety. Global grain markets do not move according to political loyalty. They move according to price, reliability, and timing. When uncertainty enters the system, buyers and sellers alike look for ways to reduce exposure. As Washington increased pressure, Canadian exporters did not argue the premise, they tested it. China understood the opportunity not as a confrontation, but as a logistical equation. With immense demand and the ability to commit at scale, it stepped in at precisely the right moment. Long-term purchases were offered when uncertainty was highest. Volumes were absorbed without disruption. Timing did the work that rhetoric never could. The physical mechanics followed quietly. Shipping routes were adjusted. Port allocations changed. Financing and insurance adapted to new flows. None of this required headlines or diplomatic ceremonies. Grains simply began moving in different directions, guided by contracts rather than commentary. For U.S. exporters, the effect was marginal at first, then structural. Expected volumes failed to materialize. Influence over pricing and routing diminished. There was no dramatic exclusion, just a growing absence. By the time the shift was visible, the decisions behind it had already been locked in. This was the blind spot, mistaking influence for control. Power in modern trade is not enforced through pressure alone, but sustained through relevance. As contracts replaced assumptions, leverage gave way to redundancy. The market did not rebel, it adjusted, and in doing so, it revealed that power, misunderstood, is often power misplaced. China did not rush into the moment. As tension between the United States and Canada slowly intensified, Beijing stayed publicly silent. There were no statements of support, no criticism of Washington, no visible attempt to exploit the situation. From the outside, it appeared detached. In reality, it was watching carefully, waiting for the point where uncertainty became opportunity. Strategic patience is most effective when others create the opening for you. As US-Canada relations grew more unpredictable, Chinese planners focused not on politics but on supply chains. Food security has long been a central priority, and grain markets reward consistency over confrontation. China understood that when pressure enters a system, suppliers begin searching for stability on their own. The move came not through diplomacy, but through commerce. State-linked buyers and major trading firms initiated quiet engagement with Canadian exporters. Conversations centered on volumes, delivery schedules, and multi-year commitments. There was no ideological framing, no demands attached, only contracts designed to reduce risk for both sides. For exporters facing uncertainty elsewhere, the appeal was obvious. Wheat access was locked in at scale, not through a single sweeping agreement, but through a series of long-term arrangements that collectively reshaped flows. These deals ensured reliable supply for China while offering predictable demand for Canada. The structure mattered: long horizons, stable pricing mechanisms, and logistical coordination that minimized friction. Crucially, the strategy avoided provocation. No tariffs were imposed, no rivals were named, no headlines announced a shift in alignment. By staying below the political radar, China ensured that the transition would be treated as routine market behavior rather than a geopolitical event. The result was durable. Without a fight, without a standoff, and without forcing a reaction, China strengthened its long-term food security. Others debated leverage and loyalty. China secured supply. In modern trade, that is often the most decisive victory of all. The shift began as a response to pressure, not a grand strategy. When uncertainty entered the system, wheat flows adjusted in search of stability. What seemed temporary at first quickly took on structure. Volumes moved, buyers adapted, sellers recalibrated, and once the market settled, it did not snap back. New logistics routes formed the backbone of the change. Shipping schedules, port allocations, financing, and insurance all aligned around the new reality. These systems are slow to build, but even slower to dismantle. Once stabilized, they create momentum of their own, reinforcing the flows they were designed to support. Contracts seal the transition. Multi-year agreements extended beyond election cycles and policy shifts, insulating trade from political mood swings. By the time officials considered recalibration, the market had already committed elsewhere. Flexibility had been replaced by obligation. For US producers, the loss was incremental but lasting. Market share eroded not through exclusion, but through absence. Relationships weakened, influence diminished. Competing on price alone proved insufficient against the certainty of locked-in demand. Even a full policy reversal could not undo what had been normalized. Trust, once redirected, rarely returns quickly. The market had found a new equilibrium, and it held. This was not a pause. It was a realignment, quiet, contractual, and permanent.